All right. So this week we are talking about energy and movement in ecosystems. To start off, let's just talk about the invasive earthworms. So during the Pleistocene, during the Ice Age, glaciers came down. And they came down and went up and came down and went up like lots of times. And each time they kind of just went further and further and further down North America. When they're coming down, glaciers are really heavy. And so they are just displacing all of this topsoil. They're just like removing all the soil like down to the bedrock. And then they went away at the end of the Pleistocene. And the results are some really cool topographical features, like you can see like Finger Lakes that are caused by these glaciers and they're retreating. A lot of the times they would leave these really big stones that they had like rolled up as they were pushing through. But one thing with the removal of all that topsoil is that a lot of North American earthworms were displaced. So anywhere where the glaciers were, they removed that topsoil, and so there was no place for earthworms to live. In the southern parts of North America, like, we still had earthworms. We had our earthworms, the ones that we're pretty common with. But as you go up, there were no earthworms. And earthworms are really slow to recolonize, to disperse, to get back to where they were. And so even though there aren't earthworms up north, it's not like the earthworms just radically spread up there. Instead, what happened is that immigrants that were coming over, so the English, the Spanish, they were coming over and they brought some plants that they had with them and inadvertently brought over European earthworms and Asian earthworms to North America. And those earthworms started colonizing. And they actually they spread out a lot quicker than our native earthworm. Another way that they spread is through anglers, so people who go fishing. A lot of times earthworm is used as bait and they escape, or you release them, or they fall off the hook or whatever and still survive. And so fishing has helped spread these earthworms a little bit. Big deal, right? Like, who cares if there are invasive earthworms up higher, like in the New England area, up in that taiga, the boreal forest, that kind of stuff? What does it matter? It's earthworms, right? What do? Well, they eat, like, dead leaves and stuff, right? They're detrivores. They eat decaying organic matter. They aerate the soil. They make paths through the soil that lets in water, lets in air. They turn over the nutrients, and so, like, they eat organic matter and then they poop it out, and it helps with nutrient recycling. So it sounds like earthworms are good. It's great that we have introduced earthworms, these invasive earthworms, into the northern forest. Unless you like salamanders. So if you don't have earthworms, what is breaking down all this leaf matter and other stuff that is like falling off the trees that's decaying? Bacteria, fungi, small insects, invertebrates, stuff like, I guess I can't think of what they're called. Little springtails, those kinds of things, columbulas. They eat this fallen material. But if the earthworms are eating it, then these things can eat that. And so the things that eat those little arthropods, those little insects, or those fungi, like redback salamanders, now they don't have enough food. And something that we've seen is a decrease in the population of a lot of our salamanders. On top of that, chytrid fungus infects amphibians. Salamanders are amphibians. So with the invasive earthworms and this deadly fungus, we're really seeing a hard hit on our earthworm, or on our amphibian populations, specifically our salamanders. And they're linking these earthworms to other issues. I think there was like some type of bird in either Wisconsin, Minnesota area that they're seeing a decrease in the population there. And they're linking it back to this trophic cascade of how the earthworms are eating the leaves that other things can't eat. And so the things that eat those other things can't eat those other things, and so those things are dying. And you just see this whole ecosystem spread extinction going on because of earthworms. It's crazy how connected all this stuff is. So energy cycling and the flow of energy through these ecosystems is really important all the way through these steps. The first thing that's important, well, probably like the most important, kind of setting up like how much biomass can you have, is based on the primary productivity. So this is talking about how much energy are you creating via photosynthesis. Creating, that's not the right word. How much energy are you transforming from solar radiation into chemical energy? How much energy are you taking from like thermo vents into chemical energy that can be used by other organisms? And we look at primary production a couple different ways. You can look at it as just like how much plants do you have? Like what is the biomass of those plants throughout the year? You could also look at the standing crop. So primary production and standing crop are a little bit different. So your primary production is going to be like all of that energy that has been transformed, right, into something that other organisms can use. Standing crop is how much of those producers do you have at any given time. So it's just like how much crop do you have, right? It's not how much energy is this corn producing and using, it is how much corn do we have right now. And we can break this primary production down. Typically you talk about like either the gross or the net primary production. So the gross is all that is being produced. The net primary production is your gross minus your respiration. So the gross is how much energy is being transformed. The net is how much of that energy that is transformed, some of it is lost based on just everyday needs of that animal via respiration, or that plant via respiration. So how much is able to be used by the next trophic level? So how much is being lost via respiration from that entire gross, and the net is like what's left over. Okay? Is there going to be a tight link between primary productivity and standing crop? Or your gross primary productivity and standing crop? Maybe. If you think like terrestrial wise, yes, definitely. The more vegetation you have, the more you have primary productivity, the more standing crop you also have. But in lakes and stuff where you have a whole bunch of algae are really small, they reproduce really fast, and typically in these situations, you can have a pretty high primary productivity with your algae, but they get eaten almost as fast as they divide. And so you can have really high primary productivity but a very small standing crop because they are getting eaten really fast by the next trophic levels as you go up. So standing crop isn't always linked or correlated with primary productivity. So how good are plants at photosynthesis? We talked last time about how much sunlight, how much sun energy actually makes it down to Earth. And we're like, well, it depends, because like a third of it gets reflected off by the atmosphere. It depends on what the surface is, so it could either get reflected off or absorbed. And like crops, plants, they do a pretty good job of absorbing. I mean, they're not near as good as like asphalt. But really, like, how much can they use of the sun's energy for photosynthesis? The answer might surprise you. They are really terrible at capturing the sun's energy. So 99% of the solar energy that makes it through the atmosphere doesn't get absorbed by plants. It gets reflected by the plants, and it doesn't get absorbed. Only like 1% of this solar energy actually gets absorbed and used for primary production. Only 1% of that solar energy gets used for primary production. And then out of that 1%, more than half of it, 60%, is lost through respiration. Only 40% of that gross primary productivity is used for growth and reproduction. So only 40% of this 1% can be used for other organisms. So we can use 40% of 1% of the sun's energy. That's not a lot. That's really inefficient, right? So, how are some different ways that we can measure the GPP, the gross primary productivity, or the net primary productivity? You can do it a couple different ways. One, you can do it by drying and weighing. So, you can come out here to a section and measure, like, just clear it out. Then you have the growing season. You remove all the plant matter. You dry it, you weigh it. You dry it because you want to get out any extra water that could be in there, because we don't want to measure how much water it can hold. We want to measure how much material is produced, how much plant matter is there, not just water. So you dry it and you weigh it, and that can give you like a mass per acre, right? So it can give you how much biomass you have per area. You could also do it on a finer scale where you can take like a plant and see how efficient it is in uptaking carbon dioxide and how much carbon dioxide it releases. So it has to take it up for photosynthesis and it has to release it for respiration. And so you can measure, okay, it takes up X amount of carbon dioxide. That's like 100% of the energy that's being produced or transformed. And then how much is being released? How much of that energy is being transformed and used by the plant? And that'll give you a percentage. And you can do the same thing with oxygen. So it has to take up oxygen for respiration, but it also releases oxygen with photosynthesis. And again, you can do a percentage of that. Another way, especially for like really big areas, so these are like for small areas, this is kind of for an intermediate thing, you can do some remote sensing. Remote sensing is where you use satellites or planes, and since we know that plants have a lot of chlorophyll reflects back green, you can measure the amount of green in an area, and that'll kind of give you like a base of how much plant or algae matter you have in this given area. and you can do this like over different years or across the year to see how that GPP can fluctuate. And of course, you can get a sample of this and run the CO2 O2s to get a finer scale. If you know what 1 can do, how big is 1 compared to this, extrapolate out. And you can get a really good idea of the productivity in a large area over time. What happens when stuff eats the plants, though? Then we get into secondary production. So primary production is the plant or the algae or the photosynthetic organism transforming that solar energy into chemical energy. Secondary production is an organism taking the energy from that primary producer and using it for its own body. And so you have your ingested energy, how much energy it eats up. So for our example here, we have some tortoises and an apple tree. So you have your net primary productivity in this apple tree. All this is stuff that could be used by another organism. It's not respired. Then you have the second organism, secondary production, come and eat part of this. You can measure how much energy it consumed just based off of what that thing is that it ate. And then from that energy, it can go two ways. It can either be egested or assimilated. So egested is the part that gets thrown out, right? Pooped out, thrown up, whatever it's doing. It's the part that is not used by the animal. And then you have your assimilated, which is the part that gets absorbed into the organism. And so for these studies, like you could feed this thing an apple, and you would know that an apple that weighs 1 kilogram, that's a really big apple, an apple that weighs 1 kilogram has X amount of energy. And then you can measure the poop. You'd be like, okay, so this thing pooped out this, and you can measure the energy in the poop. They do these things called bomb calorics, where you take something and you basically just burn it up and see how much heat it gives off. And you measure that heat energy that is being given off to get how much energy is in there. And so you can measure how much is egested, and that gives you how much is assimilated. You'd be like, okay, so if it ate this thing that has like 500 joules in it, it egested 100 joules, it assimilated 400 joules. And then you can measure like what's its respiration and all that, and just kind of like break it down as you go to get to how much energy is usable for the next level. But first, I want you to think. So we kind of talked about this. How could algae have a high productivity but a low standing crop? Because they get eaten very fast, right? And then your GPP gets divided into what? It gets divided into the net energy. That net energy is going to be stuff that is used for like growth and reproduction. And it gets divided into that energy that got used, right? That got respired. And so it can break into energy that's available for the next group and energy that is not available for the next group. And this is just kind of showing you like secondary productivity on land versus water versus primary productivity. So secondary is here, primary is down here. And you see that these two things are linked. If you have an area with high primary productivity, you're going to find an area that also is high in secondary productivity. Same for the water. High primary, you're going to get high secondary for the most part. All right. The next thing we're talking about is different ecosystems. Different ecosystems are going to have different primary productivity. Why is that?